Our intention, of course, is, again, to see how our religious traditions and the resources within our religious traditions might help us think through and name some of the challenges that we're confronting in our own day and age. And we wanted to set up some Havruta, some study groups here, in which we could look at some different texts, and you would have a chance to talk with each other and see the degree to which you think our biblical traditions name the reality and help us think through and offer up some new insights into how to respond, but also to consider the ways in which our religious traditions may be complicitous in setting in motion attitudes that are troublesome and which we may have to resist or respond to by drawing on other interpretive possibilities. So, if you will, our contention is that our values, our religious, ethical, theological dispositions are both a source of insight. They're part of the solution, if you will, but they can also be part of the problem, and so we want to look at the double-edged character of our religious traditions. Now, to name this, we wanted to take some time to look at a specific text today, namely the story of the Tower of Babel, and see what you think that narrative might have to say about, or how it might shed light on some of what you've heard from Bob. A word of introduction, and then we'll set you loose on that text for a few moments. The book of Genesis obviously deals with those first set of chapters, deal with, in a more global way, the relationship between the creation, specifically the land, the people, and God. And as it turns out, all of these players are learning how to cope with and deal with each other. So the God that's presented in the early chapters of Genesis is a God that's learning to be God and does not fit the characteristics of being omnipotent, omniscient, all-compassionate, but a God who is tangled up in this creation and is still trying to figure out how to connect to the creation in constructive and if you will, healthy, environmentally sustainable ways. In a similar way, humanity is limping along and trying to figure out how to be in relationship to the earth, the land, and God in a way that's creative. And the brunt of the difficulties among humans and between God and humans is getting absorbed by the earth. So it's very interesting that in the story of Adam and Eve, when things go awry and Adam is punished, it is the earth that is cursed. And when Cain and Abel, the first fratricide occurs, it is the absorption of the blood of Abel that gives rise to the cry from the earth. It is the earth that absorbs the blood and is stained by the violence, and it is the earth, if you will, that pays a significant price for that. And finally, after these narratives, we get to the story of Noah and the flood. And once again, you can see that as God's learning how to be God and somehow cope with the excesses of humanity, the violence of humanity, etc., the violence of the flood obviously takes an enormous toll on the creation, and indeed the story of Noah comes very close to having the creation itself go back to the chaos prior to the creation itself. So the precarious state of the earth and the land is exposed, if you will, at each step along the way. And then we get to the Tower of Babel. Or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. There are two stories which we're not going to have a chance to really unpack. I'm afraid I can get so lathered up about this story that there's no stopping me. So I'm going to try to moderate my enthusiasm a little bit here. There is on one side the text from Genesis 11, and on the other side there is an Ashanti myth. As you know, there are a number of flood narratives that are widely circulated. If you can pass the extras over here. There are a number of flood stories in different cultures, so there are a number of different myths or narratives about building towers in other cultures in circulation too. And if we had the time and luxury, I was hoping we could do some comparing and contrasting of these two. You can do that on your own. Do we need any more copies? All right, let me read out loud, and then I'll set you loose on this in your table for just a few moments. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they're one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad, and from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. There it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. So your task in your tables, and shall we have people break it in, or just for the sake of... Okay, so you're at your tables, and you can join that one. There are a couple of questions here. But what I want you to talk with each other for a few moments is, what do you think is going on in this text? And how does this text, if you will, shed light on or name some of the dilemmas that were articulated earlier in the presentation? In other words, is there a connection? Can you connect the dots between the story and the dilemmas that were articulated earlier? Is that clear enough? Okay, so let's take about well, our time is just about up. Can you take about 7 minutes?
One of them.
Do we? I don't know if it would be better just to have a kind of. I'd love for you to get to know each other a little bit. But given the time constraints, shall we just sort of have a more open-ended conversation right now? All right, let's do that. What strikes you about the story? What is your initial reaction?
It's like a human CAFO, actually. There's this concentration of people on a particular piece of land, and God says that's a bad thing.
Yeah. So what is it that say a little bit more about what you think is...
Well, it becomes toxic to the community, actually, to be that concentrated together and ignore the rest of creation. You know, part of what we're supposed to do is to have a relationship with the rest of the land.
Yeah.
And you can't do that if you're all in one spot. So you're harming the land that you're on, in a sense, and you're harming your community, the human community itself.
Yeah.
I've always viewed the story as a universal principle that God has in place around unity. That becomes one of the chief words that's used by God when He says, "Look what they do when they all come together." And we can't have this, because nothing can stop that universal principle. Unity is good for, it's effective for good or evil.
Yeah.
And as it correlates to what we saw, part of what we saw, part of the problem is monopoly. And the unity principle, really, when it's tied to an economic engine, is called monopoly.
Yeah.
And so that whole sensibility kind of drives the outcome, which essentially is against what creation was intended for, which is a celebration and a relation between God and man.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
took God out of the process.
So to push this a little bit further, the problem with unity, or the quest for unity, is that it moves towards uniformity. And uniformity, if you will, gives rise to certain totalitarian impulses.
Sure.
And it overwhelms, if you will, and homogenizes the distinctiveness and the particularity of the players, so they get, if you will, compressed into this project in a way that it becomes like an ant colony, rather than something in which the distinctive characteristics of the individuals and groups can find fuller expression.
You carried out in each of the disciplines, whether it's economics, whether it's social, political, carried out in each of those spheres, then it's corrupted. It becomes corrupted and perverted.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Jill?
I guess similarly, I see this as a scattering into multiplicity of experience in a way that resonates with biodiversity and therefore greater health.
Yes.
But within that also then is the challenge of the multiplicity of experience generates different understanding, and then opportunities for confusion.
Yeah.
And conflict rather than cooperation.
Yeah.
And so then how do we knit this thing together in a harmonious way?
Yeah. So in a sense, the poles, how do you avoid the poles of being so dispersed, so fragmented, so polarized that it's just anarchy, it's confusion, it's nobody understands anything. There's no ability to connect and forge relationship. I mean, that's one, and the other is the total loss of the group think, if you will, takes over. And so is there a way to navigate a place between the extremes? That seems to be part of the challenge that's being named by the, Bill.
I think you have to interpret this, like you said, in the context of the creation era. But if I could take issue with your project, this is God learning how to be God or man.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of reading a modern process mentality. It's not true to the text. In my own text of that, if you look at the creation narrative, it sets up a three-way relationship: God, humanity, the cosmos, nature. God gives to humanity a share in God's relationship to nature in two ways. Adam gets to name the animals, which is important to this reading here, because the ancient understanding of name, it contains the spiritual reality of the thing. So the animals aren't complete until Adam names them. Adam becomes a co-creator, completing God's creation.
Right.
The dominion Adam has is sharing God's dominion is sharing God's relationship to nature. If you violate that relationship, you alienate humanity from God, then the dominion becomes our dominion over nature, which means immediately we're alienated from nature. We're not part of it anymore. We're going to be its master. And our alienation corrupts nature by exploiting it. And here you have, let us make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
That we're going to create ourselves, and we're alienated from ourselves as well as nature, so we're going to take God's place in naming who we are.
Yeah, right. Well, this would be a longer conversation for us to go at this God learning to be God. it does say in these, at the conclusion of the story on Noah, God repents. And in a sense, God confesses having made a mistake. And the dynamics of, in any case, we could go, whether this story suggests that God is learning something from the encounter, perhaps is more open-ended. But in any case, my take on this is the portrayal of God here as a God who's threatened. Or that there's that undercurrent going on here, and so there's an element of insecurity that's being played out on virtually all levels. But you need not concur with that notion. Other responses? Yeah.
Well, just picking up on the various languages that are emerging, to me that brings to mind the differences between a scientific language, a scientific approach to the world, and a religious or a moral way of reflecting, and the way in which those traditions and many others,
yes.
the whole topic of interdisciplinary conversation, how do we do it? But in particular, those two have been divorced from one another and are no longer connecting in the way that they need to connect. We need both the knowledge of science and the moral perspective of religious life in order to find a fulfilling way of living.
Right. So, thank you, George, because that, in large measure, what we're trying to insist upon is one has to become fluent in a language other than the ones we use to self-define. So the religious community, it seems to me, is living at a time where it has to become literate in the language of science. And my own press back is that the scientific community has to become more literate in understanding how it is that values are articulated, shaped, and embodied in community in order for both of us to benefit from this. So we live after Babel, and the challenge, Jill, that you're articulating is we've got to develop a capacity or an aptitude to speak more than one language.
You know, go ahead.
Jeff, you have a chance.
So one of the streams of Jewish commentary on this is not that human labor or ambition or technology is bad. It's purposes to which they are applied. Right. So I think that that's another thing that we can be mindful about. What purposes are being served by the current food production system, right? Clearly, somebody's getting rich. Right. As opposed to all the other purposes that we would want served. And I think that's part of our contribution to the conversation. It comes up against corporate profit, and that is, pretty formidable opponent. But that's my contribution to the conversation. What purposes are we here to serve? And that comes right out of this.
I also just let's say the metaphor of the divergence of language that occurs at God's at actually what I see as triumph's impetus is replicated in the New Testament in the book of Acts in a very different way. And so if we were to use a illustration of a wheel with a hub, God being the hub and the spokes being the languages, in Acts the representation of multiple cultures and the languaging that they speak and hear each other in their native language, that diversity comes together in unity through God. And so the God that separated is now the God that brings back together for the purpose, but leaving each culture intact.
Right.
It says each of us. It doesn't say all of us. It says each, so that we are to learn sort of what you're saying, to be able to come together multidisciplinary or cross-culturally, multi-ethnic. We would learn to live because that's how God designed it in the first place. And these kind of dilemmas create a springboard for us to really start getting it right. That's what I mean. The challenge is not so much what's wrong, because everybody can give a comment on what's wrong. How do we get it right and come out? What can we do to point it to the correct solution so that it doesn't remain a problem? Because it's evident that it's a problem.
Roseanne?
Yeah, I want to pick up on George's point, because I think it's an interesting move to think about language not as French, German, Spanish, Chinese, but the language of science and the language of religion and the language of poetry. And I guess for me, it's less a matter of having to learn to be conversant in someone else's language, because I'm never going to be George in any stretch.
That's a good thing.
Say what?
And that's a good thing.
Well, maybe. I don't know.
In her case, I don't know.
But where I think it's interesting and it connects with what we're about here is that if we had a kind of disciplinary humility, where we truly believe that other languages have something to add to the conversation, then it's in all directions. That sort of gives me some measure of hope, not much. Those of you who know me know I don't dally in those romantic notions very much. But in the face of what Bob just laid out for us, it seems to me that the only possible move toward addressing that kind of massive problem is that at first we realize no discipline is going to solve it by itself, number one. And number two, it's going to take a concerted effort across the board. And for a concerted effort to work, it has to mean that I actually come to the table thinking that I have something to learn from someone whose language is different from mine. And I just think that's kind of a move more toward not only the desire, but the need, now that the problems are so massive, that we need a level of humility and cooperation that we haven't had before.
That's great, Roseanne. And it seems to me that the humility, on the one hand, comes from a recognition of the limits about our own knowledge and our own experience, but it also calls into question the impulse that gave rise to the construction of this tower in the first place, namely the making, and Bill, this corresponds, I think, to what you were saying earlier, about making a name for ourselves, as though, in a sense, we're trying to displace, and there's so much in our culture that keeps hammering on us, you got to go out and make a name for yourself. We create ourselves. And it seems to me this narrative, in some sense, is trying to insist on an ontological humility about, no, our being in the world is not something, it was a gift. It wasn't something that we manufactured, that we produced on our own. And unless we allow ourselves to be named by a reality bigger than ourselves, then we end up, if you will, pursuing projects that are very destabilizing.
Well, that line, I have no trouble seeing this reading as like God's self-defense against our tendency to idolatry. Because even if a language is more than just different words, but it's a different worldview.
Yes.
Right. Then the different languages includes even like the diversity of religions, the different ways that we approach reality, which imagine the idolatry we would be capable of if we all had the same religion. We had God in a bottle. It's like this, the importance of the different languages in terms of keeping that humility and learning from each other.
I wish that our religious communities could catch up with that insight. Yeah.
The aha that I'm getting out of more of the conversation than the text is the idea of avoiding the two poles, as you were sort of summarizing. And
Yes.
I think that happens. I'm a social justice advocate from way back, and so I think those of us who do that kind of work get very polarized, into right and wrong and good and evil, and I think that comes into play also theologically as well. And how do we look for the gray areas, so not laying out to people that there's a perfect way of doing things, but how do you move in the right direction? And how do you, it was really interesting when Dr. Lawrence was speaking, to think about carrots rather than sticks. So how do you promote this in a way that's attractive for people to move there rather than guilt tripping everyone?
Right. Yeah. Well,
Can I just, if Chris gets excited about stuff, those of you who know me know that I can barely contain myself either. One of the things that's striking me in this conversation is the line in the Cain and Abel text. The question, actually, am I my brother's keeper? And if the answer to that question is yes, rather than no, what would it mean if I now were to say my obligation is to make a name, using Bill's notion here, that my obligation is to make a name for my brother, not a name for myself, that in some way to empower, if you will, or to care for the other is a more important obligation than making a name for myself. So in a sense, I guess what I want to say is that the text is teaching me how not to be.
Right.
That the question raised in the Cain and Abel text, if you keep reading, this is how not to do it. You're not going to be your brother or your sister's keeper by trying to make a name for yourself. So the option is what? Well, either I make a name for you or we make a name together for each other. And it seems to me that in terms of the theological, ecological issues, that if we don't figure out how together to make a name for ourselves communally, we're not going to survive. And so this text, it seems to me, maybe in conjunction with the Cain and Abel text at some other point, would be a really good model for pushing forward this collaborative humility notion.
Right. Well, listen, I thank you all for lingering 12 minutes past what we really do try to be punctual and